Welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicola Pratt and I am the president of BRISMES. I'll be chairing this evening's event. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. The BRISMES Annual Lecture provides an opportunity for members and non-members alike to hear from a distinguished scholar or expert within the field of Middle Eastern studies. It is one of the major events in the BRISMES calendar, and it's free to attend and open to everyone. And we are delighted to have such a wide audience joining us this evening. Tonight, I'm especially pleased that the lecture will be given by Professor Ilan Pappé, Director of the European Centre for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter and a Senior Fellow at the University of Exeter's Institute for Arab and Islamic Studies. Professor Pappé will be introduced in just a moment by his colleague, Dr. Nadia Nasser Najab, Senior Lecturer in Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. Before that, I would like to take a moment to tell you a little bit about BRISMES for those who may be new to us. So we were founded in 1973, and we provide a forum for educators and researchers in Middle East studies. Our membership is open to all, regardless of nationality or country of residence. Our mission is to promote interest in Middle East studies and to raise awareness of the region and its connections with other parts of the world, including the UK. Middle East studies is a wide and diverse field spanning the humanities and social sciences and reaching from the present day all the way back to classical antiquity. BRISMES works to support this breadth of scholarship in a variety of ways. In addition to the annual lecture, we hold an annual conference each summer, which draws participants from around the world and showcases the latest research across all aspects of Middle East studies in Britain and beyond. And the call for papers for the conference is currently open. We also host a range of webinars throughout the year. And BRISMES also publishes the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, and we offer funding and prizes to support and recognise outstanding research in this field. If you're not already a member, please do consider joining. Membership provides access to the journal, reduced conference registration rates, and eligibility to apply for BRISMES funding opportunities. So thank you again for being with us this evening. I will now hand over to Dr. Nadia Nasser Najab.
Thank you so much, Nicola and all. It's a great honor to introduce Professor Ilan Pappé, a scholar of global status whose work is as intellectually rigorous as it is ethically grounded. We are privileged to have him deliver the BRISMES Annual Lecture entitled Why There is a Need for Palestine Studies. As both a colleague and a friend, I see his scholarship as a reflection of his unwavering commitment to justice and liberation. What distinguishes Ilan's work is not only its analytical depth, but its rootedness in activism. This fusion of critical inquiry and moral courage makes his contributions not only powerful, but profoundly necessary. And so, for such an exceptional person, I would prefer to move a little beyond the usual introduction. After earning his PhD from the University of Oxford, Ilan taught at the University of Haifa until 2007 in both the Department of Middle Eastern History and the Department of Political Science. During his time there, he not only produced a groundbreaking scholarship that challenged dominant narratives about the Nakba and the ongoing Zionist settler colonial project, but also defended his students whose research came under attack. One such case was that of Teddy Katz, whose MA thesis documented the 1948 Tantura massacre, when the university, under political pressure, stripped Katz of his degree, and the Israeli court pursued him. Ilan stood by him, defending both his integrity of the research and the right to academic freedom. for this and for his principled political convictions, the university rendered his position untenable, ultimately forcing his resignation. In 2009, Ilan joined the University of Exeter as professor of history. I began working with him in 2011 as an early career scholar. Ilan's support was unequivocal. That helped me build my career and develop as a scholar through genuine support and encouragement. As both coordinators of the European Center for Palestine Studies, I got to know Ilan more closely as we worked together to make Palestine study at the center of scholarship and as part of interdisciplinary research. Ilan insisted that Palestine should be studied through the lens of settler colonialism theories, undeterred by voices of opposition. When our students organized a conference on settler colonialism that took place between 2nd and 4th of October 2015 in Exeter, and the conference sought to explore the application of settler colonialism perspective to Palestine. External actors objected, calling the conference one-sided. Ilan stood firm, defended students, and fought back, insisting that it is part of academic freedom, and the conference went ahead. It remains a landmark moment in our collective intellectual life. His scholarly work and activism attract students from around the world to study with us and act. What is unique about our program is our commitment in bridging academic inquiry with advocacy, public engagement, and direct actions. I have seen Ilan stand firm in the face of intimidation and pressure, especially when accusations of anti-Semitism or incitement are weaponized to silence critique. During student encampment, Ilan was there, close to the students, listening to their demands, supporting and participating. As a Palestinian academic and activist, I can say that working with Ilan has been not only intellectually enriching, but profoundly reassuring. I feel empowered by his courage and passionate support. Ilan is a source of hope and inspiration to many Palestinians and activists. His work sets an example of can, that scholarship can and must serve liberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia, for that wonderful introduction and for all the reasons that Nadia mentioned. This was why BRISMES also awarded Ilan the award for outstanding services to Middle East studies earlier this year. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Ilan. Before he starts speaking, I should say that Ilan's lecture will be around 45 minutes, and then afterwards there'll be time for questions. And if you would like to ask a question, then please use the Q&A function on Zoom in order to pose your question. Thank you. Over to you, Professor Ilan Pappé.
Thank you. Thank you to the people in BRISMES for organizing this event, and earlier on for giving me the honor of the award. Thank you, Nicola, for your support, and thank you, Nadia, for this incredible introduction that I hope I deserve. Thank you very much. I'm very moved by it and very much encouraged by it. From Edward Said's famous article, Permission to Narrate, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, to the works of Palestinian scholars such as Rana Barakat in her seminal article, Writing Palestine Studies, much scholarly attention and activist energy have been devoted to the question of who tells the story of Palestine. It is not solely a matter of discourse or intellectual pursuit. The struggle to articulate Palestine's past, present, and future is both existential and material. Sustained by academic work, narrative influence, as we all know, school curricula, mainstream media coverage, mainstream media discourses and reportage, cultural productions such as films, theaters, TV series, documentary and fictional films, and of course, policies. As seen in Palestine, Israel invests an incredible amount of energy and resources in attempting to validate its territorial claims and justify its policies, often based on quote unquote scientific academic research, as I've tried to unearth in my book, The Idea of Israel. In many ways, the contest over narrative can be seen as a zero-sum game, where acceptance or successful validation undermines and even prevents any counterclaims. This is certainly the hope of those who control a given narrative and fight to maintain discursive domination. While Israel has long held the upper hand when it comes to representation in global mainstream media, in the political decision-making arena, and in many parts of the global North public opinion, the presence and mounting strength of the Palestinian story galvanizes support for decolonization and liberation. What empowers the Palestinian version, in particular in the global South, and recently also in many sections of the global North, is that the Palestinian story, or rather stories in plural, could be shared and connected to nodes in other anti-colonial narratives and decolonial struggles. Yet successfully shifting the story, seizing the power to narrate without seeking permission, following the request of Edward Said many years ago, this kind of effort also requires a specific vocabulary. Discourse and language can spotlight how past and present injustices are grounded in claims to truth, supported by the work of academics, the labor of politicians and media outlets. Public acceptance and uncritical circulation of these claims might shape the future, affecting crucial decisions by political elite which have the power to stop criminality, dispossession, and genocide. While it is true that the narrow political interests, economic and strategic agendas account for the indifference and at times for the complicity of governments around the world towards the genocide in Gaza in the last 2 years, these political elites felt the need to justify this disregard for a televised genocide and their continued supply of military and diplomatic aid to the perpetrators of the genocide with a certain narrative and dictionary. Justification was required because civil societies did not concur with the policies pursued. The official justification was based on the vocabulary and contexts provided by Israel and its allies, while the policies themselves were challenged by a counter vocabulary and historical narrative, one which adopted with various degrees of familiarity by millions of people who demonstrated for Palestine and challenged the government's policies on the ground. This counter vocabulary can be found in the new field of Palestine Studies that offers a body of experience and a living dictionary with which to frame a historical and moral context for the contemporary reality on the ground. A dictionary whose entries are the product of academic acumen and scholarly work, cognizant of the power of knowledge to produce violence as well as to oppose it. At the same time, this discipline gives us practical, political, and imaginative tools for building a different reality, not only in Palestine, but in many other parts of the world. In various works, and there are not that many, following the academic work on Palestine, the emergence of the field at times is presented as an antidote to another field of studies, Israel studies. Let us examine this assumption that Palestine studies is a reaction to Israel studies. There's no doubt that the two fields are connected. But while acknowledging this connection, one must take care to avoid reproducing the discursive and political terrain in which Israel and Zionism create the condition of possibility for Palestine. Countries are not usually an area of study, nor do they often constitute disciplines by themselves. Yet Israeli scholars and their supporters adopted this very approach when establishing Eretz Israel Studies and later Israel Studies departments within Israeli universities and centers for Israel studies abroad. Beyond the discipline, many Jewish studies departments devote a prominent part of their program to Israel and Zionism, reinforcing the links between knowledge and power. It should be noted, though, that in recent years a more critical approach emerged towards Zionism both in Israel and the Jewish studies departments in the USA. It is very likely, or at least I hope it's very likely, that this trend will continue in the future. But those who produce knowledge in Israel and in other parts of the world are still loyal to the Zionist narrative. While institutional departments and their associated academics vowed an unequivocal commitment to quote-unquote objective and quote-unquote unbiased academic research, they also declared that only Zionist scholars were qualified to work within this new field of inquiry, namely Israel studies. Their rationale was to provide academic scaffolding for the Israeli Zionist narrative about the past and present realities in Palestine. From its inception, when it was still Zionist studies and not Israel studies, it was a search for scholarly validity to support the Zionist argument that Palestine was a land without people, waiting for the return of its original inhabitants. Zionist scholars, in particular Orientalists and archaeologists, contributed their expertise to the group of leaders that planned and executed the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians during 1948, as they would assist later in policing the millions of Palestinians under occupations since 1967. Thus, quite a few of the Israeli academics lent their knowledge and influence to the brutal exercise of colonial power. While this vision of depopulation, of depopulating Palestine from its indigenous people, was partially realized through the Nakba in 1948 and Israel's subsequent ethnic cleansing policies, scholarly energy has also been recruited to further indigenize Jewish, now Israeli settlers, and strip Palestinians of their claims to land and indigeneity. This project requires political, social, economic, cultural, and intellectual labor carried out in part by Israeli and pro-Israeli academics working in specific institutions and departments. The denial of Palestinian presence, indigeneity, and rights within academic knowledge production does not merely complement or reflect the attempt to physically expunge Palestinians from Palestine. Rather, it animates the elimination of the native as the logic of settler colonization. Framed like this, it is possible to see Palestine studies taking shape as a decolonial antidote to this project of erasure and denial. These roots tell the story, the roots of Palestine studies tell the story of Palestine study as an insistence on presence and visibility, a knowledge project as a strategy for survival. Yet narrating the emergence of Palestine studies as enabled by the development of Israel studies risk reproducing the violence that Palestinian scholars, activists, educators, and organizers are fighting to make known. Tying Palestine studies so firmly to Israel studies can only work if it is truly committed to working in decolonial and anti-colonial ways. This is why in Exeter, we insisted, despite a lot of pressure on us, not to call our center a Center for Israel and Palestine Studies, and we insisted on calling it exclusively Center for Palestine Studies, in which we also teach the history, the society, the politics of Israel. This is why it is important to note that Palestine studies in many ways, like Palestine itself, preceded Israel studies, as Palestine preceded Israel. And this can clearly be shown through retracing the origin of Palestine studies. Grounded in scholarly knowledge, cultural production, political organizing, and everyday life, Palestine studies traces its roots to a rich intellectual history created by and for Palestinians. It does not begin with a single moment or event. Rather, Palestine studies developed as a discipline through a process of struggle and a convergence of forces, a drawing together of experience, narrative, and imagination, challenging the invisibility of the Palestinians from the moment their homeland was chosen by a Western alliance in the late 19th century as the locus for solving Europe's Jewish problem. Within the story of Palestine studies, the Nakba constitutes a watershed moment that throttled every aspect of Palestinian life, including the scholarly and academic structures that emerged during the British Mandate in between 1918 and 1948. During the mandatory period, a hostile policy prevented Palestinians from opening a university, while permitting the Jewish community, the small settler community, to establish two such institutions. However, the Palestinian intellectual life empowered and utilized the various teachers' colleges. The most important of them was the Arab College in Jerusalem, as institution for research, education, and scholarly exchange. In a similar way, universities in neighboring Arab countries acted as springboards for individual academic careers, which helped to build human capital for the Palestinian society. Especially notable in this respect were the American University in Beirut and the American University in Cairo. These individual careers, or these graduates who pursued these individual careers, became journalists, writers, academics, and researchers who, after 1948, were forced to pursue their careers and professions outside of Palestine, contributing significantly to the development of the media and educational systems in countries such as Kuwait and Iraq and other parts of the Middle East. Institutionalized forms and sites of knowledge were nearly decimated by this campaign of devastation and displacement in 1948. Villages and their seats of learning were razed. Teachers and elders were displaced or killed. And archives of collective history were geographically scattered. Particularly significant, as shown by the work of Jish Amit, was the big robbery of the private and collective libraries lost as a result of this Israeli looting. Some of the books were destroyed and burnt. Others were taken as spoils of war and housed in the Israeli National Library at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The Nakba did not end with the establishment of the Israeli state, and it is ongoing. Palestinians, as you know, refer to these structural destruction and incremental destruction of Palestine as al-Nakba al-Mustamira, the ongoing Nakba. This means acknowledging that the cultivation and sharing of knowledge remains a target for elimination, whether through destruction, omission, or assimilation, or expropriation. And yet a rich intellectual practice has persisted, growing in depth and driven in part by non-institutionalized ways of knowing. Palestine Studies owes credit to storytelling, embodied memory, and artistic expressions as much as academic labor. In the years after 1948, energy and resources were dedicated to rebuilding Palestinian scholarly institutions in sites that circumvented territorial control and separation, and in ways that defied the project of erasure. Two major Palestinian research bodies appeared in Beirut, in Lebanon, in the space of 2 years: the Institute of Palestine Studies in 1963 and the PLO's Palestine Research Center in 1965. Along with other public intellectuals, the Palestine Research Center's first director, Fayez Sayed, laid the foundation for what would later be recognized as Palestine Studies. The intellectual effort of the center included introducing concepts such as settler colonialism to define Zionism and anti-colonial to describe the Palestinian struggle, long before the advent of settler colonial studies as an academic field. Between 1965 and 1982, 40 researchers associated with the Palestine Research Center produced more than 300 publications, creating the foundational body of work for a discipline. As knowledge of, and in Arabic-speaking world, many of these books and articles were not accessible in English, which posed a challenge for reaching wider audiences with shared intellectual and political interests. This obstacle was surmounted by the Institute of Palestine Studies publication of the Journal of Palestine Studies, the JPS, in 1971, as well as its establishment of a Washington, D.C. branch in 1983, dedicated to producing English language publication and publishing the Journal of Palestine Studies in English. Along with the Jerusalem Quarterly, a second English language journal founded by the Institute of Palestine Studies in 1998, and its parallel publications in Arabic and French, these were some of the first safe scholarly spaces for thinking and writing on Palestine. The journal, since then, other publications in the same vein appeared: the Journal of Palestine and Holy Land Studies, the Palestine Yearbook of International Law, the Palestine-Israel Journal, and the Palestine-Israel Review, to mention some of them. This was followed by book series and monograph series in prestigious publishing houses devoted to Palestine studies. This investment in research and publication emerged in the context of sustained attacks on dispersed Palestinian archives and the continuing oppression of academic life in the occupied territories. In places like Beirut and Jerusalem, repositories of collective knowledge faced looting, seizure, and destruction, often at the hands of the Israeli state and army. The Palestine Research Center itself was targeted by such actions, including a 1983 car bombing in Beirut that occurred during the same period as raids intended by Israel to uproot the PLO's leadership out of southern Lebanon and out of Beirut. Worryingly, the story does not stop there. As Hannah Sleiman reminds us, and I quote, "Archives do not perpetually serve the narrative of their creator. Rather, they come to serve the narrative of their captor. Upon creation, the documents in the PLO offices were intended to serve quotidian purposes. Once the Israeli army stole them, it extracted them from the domain of the PLO's administration and put them in the domain of Israel's narrative. The PLO documents could not fend for themselves. They could not curate themselves in order to serve a Palestinian narrative." End of quote. Yet these concerted attempts to further dispossession and erasure have failed to deter generation after generation of Palestinian scholars and scholars of Palestine from reconstructing the past, analyzing the present, and imagining the future wherever they may be. The effort to cultivate, protect, and circulate knowledge of Palestine has been enriched by the development of intersectional fields of inquiry elsewhere, including cultural, decolonial, feminist, indigenous, Marxist, and post-colonial studies. By working in connective ways across discipline, contexts, struggles, and scales, scholars of Palestine studies have successfully challenged the Orientalist approach that once dominated Western scholarship on the region and Palestine and their people. Until the 1980s, this approach largely enabled Israeli academics to play a central role in determining the research agenda on Palestine. An important milestone in challenging this dominance was the 1978 publication of Edward Said's Orientalism, a critical treatise on discourse and power, grounded in literary criticism, art history, and cultural studies. While key to the development of postcolonial studies more broadly, Said's work bolstered Palestine studies by contributing to the deconstruction of the Zionist narrative. Rather than reflecting an empirical or historical reality as claimed, this story could now definitively be located within the world of colonial and imperial discourses used to justify past and present oppression. The pendulum swung from one side to the other quite dramatically. Where Palestinian narratives were once considered figments of Oriental imagination, and the Israeli Zionist story as product of erudite scholarly research, now Zionist scholarship could be placed under intellectual scrutiny. Cultivated partly in the universities of the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinian knowledge became respected as valid and essential, narrated in its own terms. Let me say something now about the present state of Palestine studies. On these broad shoulders rests the present field of Palestine studies, now a recognized area of inquiry in a growing number of academic centers around the world. Between 2010 and 2020, center, units, and projects of Palestine studies were opened at Brown and Columbia University in the United States, University of Cambridge, Oxford, SOAS, and University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, and most recently in the University of Lisbon in Portugal. Similar initiatives appeared in Qatar, Malaysia, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina, as well as in South Africa, complementing a growing interest in the Arab world and the development of dedicated academic programs. And if you are in a university that still doesn't have a Center for Palestine Studies, I hope this kind of spread of institution will also encourage you to initiate such an institute in your own location. At the same time, in universities throughout the West and South American, courses focusing on Palestine have enriched the curricula of area studies, politics, and international relations. In the past, Palestine-focused modules or courses were located in conflict studies, or at best appeared in Middle Eastern Studies department. At worst, they were limited to Jewish and Israeli Studies departments. With the emergence of dedicated institutions, programs, and courses across the globe, Palestine has become integral to scholarly discussions about decolonization, indigenous studies, international law, and genocide studies. The new disciplinary homes for Palestine studies denote not only an intellectual decision to release Palestine from areas of inquiry such as conflict studies, but also the issue a moral imperative. The rearticulation of Palestine's history, present reality, and future trajectory is part of a wider movement for decolonization that holds knowledge accountable to power while driving towards the restoration of land and justice. Scholars of Palestine studies join others whose voices, experiences, and aspiration have been violently erased or marginalized in spaces including the academy. By working across contexts and struggles, researchers, educators, and organizers speak to new forms of solidarity, means of resistance, and imagination of the future. In contrast to dominant systems and structure, these ways of being and knowing are not defined or necessarily accessible to the West as a locus of theory, action, and power. Decolonial thought and praxis stand on their own terms. Yet within the project to decolonize knowledge, Palestine stands out in one regard. It remains the only focus of inquiry consistently undermined by governments and media in the West, as well as by mainstream academic managements. Whether intimidated by the Israeli state, charged with anti-Semitism, or accused of Holocaust denial, those who direct our attention to the relationship between knowledge, power, and violence in Palestine are met with a special kind of vehemence. While at first anti-colonial struggles, such as the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN in Algeria, the Mao Mao in Kenya, the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, or Viet Cong in Vietnam, suffered a similar negative framing as terrorist organization, in the end of the previous century, they were hailed as legitimate liberation movements. The PLO was not that fortunate, and its delegitimization was led by a powerful anti-Palestine coalition consisting of Christian Zionists that dates to the mid-19th century, neoconservatism, and a strong pro-Israeli Jewish lobby in the West. Working in tandem with Jewish Zionism, this powerful political, material, cultural, and intellectual alliance dominated the research agenda on Palestine well into the end of the 20th century, effectively circumscribing knowledge of the liberation movement. As it grows, Palestine studies have thus faced not only the exclusion of history and silencing of lived experience, but also concerted attempts to expunge the Palestinian anti-colonial struggle from Western knowledge. Thinker and sociologist Anibal Quijano described this process in colonial and post-colonial context as a comprehensive form of erasure. Allow me to quote one paragraph from his work in this respect. Colonialism, he says, was a product of a systematic repression, not only of the specific beliefs, ideas, images, symbols, or knowledge that were not useful to global colonial domination, while at the same time the colonizers were expropriating from the colonized their knowledge, specifically in mining, agriculture, engineering, as well as their products and work. The repression fell, above all, over the modes of knowing, of producing knowledge, of producing perspective, images, and systems of images, symbols, modes of signification over the resources, patterns, and instrument of formalized and objectivized expression, intellectual or visual. It was followed by the imposition of the use of the rulers' own patterns of expression and of their beliefs and images with reference to the supernatural. These beliefs and images serve not only to impede the cultural production of the dominated, but also as a very efficient means of social and cultural control when the immediate repression ceased to be constant and systematic, unquote. The near-totalizing system of suppression recalls the metrics revealed by Said's Orientalism, wherein the relationship between discourse, knowledge, and power does not simply reflect reality, but powerfully shapes it. Yet the story of Palestine studies continues to be written, with new and old pathways enabling scholars, educators, organizers, and activists to chart a future determined not by dominant structures and existing relations of power, but by collective vision and action in the service of liberation. Palestine studies might also be understood as a point of confluence, a place where streams meet and join, and from which they flow together as something greater. Palestine studies will continue to benefit from the theoretical nuances, comparative case studies, and strategies of resistance offered by indigenous studies, literature, social psychology, economics, international law, transnationalism, settler colonial studies, and cultural studies. Let me finish by looking into the future. The most important challenge facing Palestine studies is to find better ways of articulating the role scholars and academia can play in the actual struggle for decolonization in Palestine, as well as in finding more effective way for practicing and expanding solidarity with those Palestinians who daily face destruction as occurred in the last 2 years all over historical Palestine, and in particularly in the Gaza Strip. The fusion of scholarship and activism is not new in the study of Palestine. From its inception, Palestine Studies has been an action-oriented discipline, much more than a knowledge project confined to an ivory tower. Students and scholars of Palestine are thinkers and activists, based on a shared belief that knowledge both derives from and remains accountable to the real world outside the academia. This echoes the sources of Palestinian intellectual life highlighted earlier, when were non-institutionalized ways of knowing, including storytelling, embodying memory and artistic expression, are central to a field of study that seeks transformation. Put simply, Palestine Studies has always been about being in and acting upon the world. Today, activism is integrated, sometimes explicitly enshrined, in the mission statements of institutional centers, academic programs, and individual modules that focus on Palestine. And if it's not integrated, it should be integrated there. This close alignment requires scholars and educators to consider how their commitment to professionalism and scholarly expertise sits with an equal dedication to the Palestinian cause. As someone who has directed the first ever Palestine Studies program in the Global North, I can attest that this dual allegiance enhances academic quality rather than impeding it. The courage to state one's political position and the desire to go beyond analysis have enormously enriched Palestine Studies and the other fields it touches. Scholars of Palestine demonstrate a remarkable will to contribute to addressing the complex, interlocking problems faced by Palestinians wherever they are. From settler colonial violence and authoritarianism to climate change, health inequality, and food insecurity, researchers and educators are doing the work of critical analysis. At the same time, this energy is directed towards a decolonial future. For some, the labor of prognosis, forecasting, or anticipating reveals a desire to help produce an antidote to the political disunity that pervades the Palestinian national movement today as a result of geographical fragmentation in the past. For others, their future work draws Palestine together with aligned struggles in which they are also active or invested. These visions might move us towards a renewed sense of the international. Despite the clear rigor and innovation, this fusion of activism with academia opens Palestine Studies to criticism and attempts at suppression. Warnings are issued, content scrutinized, and speech policed, ironically often in the name of free speech, with increasing regularity from the United States to Germany, and of course in Palestine itself. In Britain, the PREVENT program is increasingly mobilized to silence debates and research on Palestine. Developed as a counterterrorism initiative that identifies those most vulnerable, and I quote, to being drawn into extremism prior to radicalization, PREVENT empowers institutions and their employees to provide the police with information about activities, ideas, and identities. On university campuses, this has largely been interpreted as a move to challenge Islamic extremism. Yet over the past 5 years, probably the last 6 years, centers, programs, courses, and individual scholars associated with Palestine studies have come under increasing suspicion and control. A similar attempt at regulation can be seen in the equation of criticism of Israel with Holocaust denial, made possible through a new international Holocaust Remembers Alliance, the IHRA definition. The assault is ongoing, targeting Palestinian researchers, educators, and organizers with a particular degree of ferocity, especially towards young Palestinian women scholars. In January 2022, Shahad Abu Salama, an associate lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University, was suspended from teaching on the basis of views previously expressed on social media. Abu Salama's efforts to contextualize a protest banner supporting the Palestinian cause were met with accusation of anti-Semitism, a formal investigation by her university, and a concerted smear campaign conducted by the Israeli lobby groups along with right-wing media. And the list of similar cases, especially of vulnerable young women in the academia, is too long to mention in this lecture, and we have some of these examples happening in our own university in Exeter. The official reaction in the global north, and particularly in Britain and the United States, to the Israeli operations in the Gaza Strip since the 7th of October 2023, brought new attempts to silence free academic discussion on Palestine. This time it was the students as activists who were targeted by university authorities under pressure from the pro-Israeli lobby. We do not yet know if the pressure will be expanded to the study and research itself. Whether it does or does not, it seems anyone involved in Palestine studies will continue to commit their intellectual vision, political will, and activism to decolonize the knowledge production on Palestine and continue to be part of the struggle for liberation and justice on the ground. It is not only insisting on a certain story of the past or analysis of the present. It is also a belief that narration plays a role, modest as it might be, in confronting dehumanization and racism, connecting people and struggles, and building a future in which knowledge serves the aims of justice and liberation. Let me finish by exemplifying how scholarly work on Palestine is essential for having a profound and reliable understanding of the recent event in Palestine, which seemed to attract attention worldwide. Support for Palestine or position against Palestine became an issue in the context of in the contest for the leadership in the British Labour Party. It was part of the bones of contention in the 2024 French national election, especially in the second round, in the Democratic Party search for candidate in the USA in 2024, and it featured prominently in the 2025 mayoral elections in New York, to mention by few such manifestations. Official Israel demanded since October 2023 that the events of the 7th of October 2023 will not be analyzed within a historical context, as for instance was suggested by the Secretary General of the United Nations. Academics in Germany were warned that contextualizing historically that day and the reaction to it might be considered as supporting terrorism and anti-Semitism. Prevent and IHRA definition became tools for alleging that historical contextualization and even a pure professional analysis guided by deep knowledge of anti-colonialist struggles are tantamount to incitement for terrorism and anti-Semitism. Nonetheless, in Palestine studies all over the world, we insisted on the historical context. We explained that Europe's indifference towards the genocide in the last 2 years, and sometimes its complicity in it, were the result of the deep European involvement in the inception of the Zionist project as the best solution to the problem of European anti-Semitism between 1850 to 1945. Planting a European Jewish state at the heart of the Arab world at the expense of the Palestinians was only possible through violence and coercion. Maintaining it, once indigenous resistance emerged, forced the West to take part in the systematic violation of the Palestinians' basic civic, and human rights. Contextualizing the events takes us back to 1948 and the creation of the Gaza Strip as a mega refugee camp, the biggest refugee camp of its kind in the world, a receptor of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who had been expelled during the Nakba, bringing to end the history of the provincial capital and district of Gaza, organically connected to the rest of Palestine with an impressive history of architecture, literature, and trade. And finally, this contextualizing allows us, as social scientists, to acknowledge the link between the ideological transformation of Israel from an aspiring liberal democracy, which we quite doubt it ever had been, to a theocracy of zealots, or zealotocracy, regarding liberal Israeli Jews as much as Palestinians as the enemies on the way of the making of a pure Jewish greater Israel from the river to the sea and quite possible beyond the border of historical Palestine. Whether we are historians or social scientists, we should use our professional knowledge to warn against this trajectory with the help of the right vocabulary, providing the adequate analysis for those who will take it upon themselves to restore justice and peace to the torn land of Palestine in the future. This is my last sentence, but before that, I want to thank Nadia, who introduced me, and my colleague Katie Netanel, and my friend and colleague Tarek Dana in the Doha Institute in Qatar for helping with earlier versions of this idea that were published as article in several places. Thank you for your cooperation and contribution for this exposure of a field that I hope will thrive and expand until there will be no need for such particular studies, because justice and liberation will return to Palestine. Thank you.